The wind was a thief. It stole the warmth from Alara's bones, the moisture from the cracked earth, and the last vestiges of hope from the dust-choked air. It was a constant, keening presence across the flat, unforgiving plains of the Wyoming Territory, a landscape so vast and empty it seemed to have swallowed the sky itself. Her life here, on her uncle's failing ranch, had been whittled down to a series of harsh, repetitive tasks, each one a small surrender. The sun beat down with a malevolent intensity, baking the soil into a pale, fractured crust. Today, it felt personal, a weight pressing on her shoulders as she hauled 2 heavy buckets of water from the well. Her hands were raw, her calico dress patched and faded to the color of the dirt. Each step from the creaking winch to the dusty porch was a careful negotiation against the treacherous ground and her own exhaustion. The water sloshed, precious and cool, a stark contrast to the searing heat of the day. She thought only of the trough for the horses, of their grateful, velvet noses, of the small moment of purpose that simple act afforded her. Her uncle, Thaddeus, was waiting on the porch. He sat hunched in a wicker chair that groaned under his weight, a permanent scowl etched into his florid face. He smelled of cheap whiskey and resentment, a scent that clung to the dry wood of the house itself. He watched her approach, his eyes small and mean, missing nothing. He saw the way her shoulders slumped, the tremor in her arms. He saw weakness, and weakness was a thing he loved to punish. As she drew level with the steps, her foot caught on a loose board. The world tilted. One bucket slipped from her grasp, its contents splashing across the parched planks of the porch in a dark, spreading stain that evaporated almost as soon as it appeared. The waste was obscene. A gasp caught in her throat, a knot of pure, cold fear. She froze, the remaining bucket heavy in her hand, her gaze fixed on the dark, wet wood. The silence that followed was heavier than the heat, thicker than the dust. It was the silence of a held breath, of a predator about to strike. Clumsy fool, Thaddeus's voice was a low growl, thick with disgust. He rose from his chair, his bulk blocking out the sun. Alara flinched, instinctively curling into herself, a gesture learned and perfected over 2 long years. He took a step toward her, and she could see the fury building in his face, the tightening of his jaw. That water was for the stock. Hauled on my land, from my well. You think it's here for you to spill like some city so? He backhanded her, the blow sharp and stunning. Her head snapped to the side, the sting bringing tears to her eyes. But she did not cry out. She had learned long ago that sound only fed his rage. Behind the main house, coiled on a nail by the woodshed, was a braided leather whip. It was meant for stubborn mules, but Thaddeus had found other uses for it. He turned, his intent a palpable thing in the air. "I'll teach you the value of a day's labor," he snarled, moving toward the shed. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was a familiar terror, but it never lessened. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the sharp, singing crack of the leather. A new sound cut through the tension. The soft crunch of boots on gravel. Neither she nor her uncle had heard him approach. A man stood near the corner of the barn, his shadow falling long and sharp in the afternoon sun. He was the new hired hand, a man named Silas, who had arrived a week prior. He was a quiet, solitary figure, with eyes the color of a stormy sky and a stillness about him that was unnerving. He'd barely spoken a dozen words to anyone, simply doing his work with a grim, efficient competence that made Thaddeus both respect and resent him. He held a length of rope in one hand, his work seemingly interrupted. He was just watching, his expression unreadable. Thaddeus, whip now in hand, turned to face him. "What are you looking at, cowboy? Get back to your work. This is family business." Silas didn't move. His gaze shifted from Thaddeus to Alara, still frozen on the porch, and then back to the whip. A flicker of something crossed his face, a tightening around his mouth. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another. He moved with a kind of liquid grace that was at odds with his solid frame. The dust settled around his worn boots. Thaddeus hefted the whip, a sneer twisting his lips. I give the orders here. He lifted his arm, the leather tail uncoiling like a serpent. Elara's breath hitched. Time seemed to slow, to thicken like molasses. She saw the flick of her uncle's wrist, the beginning of the arc. But before it could fall, Silas closed the remaining distance in 2 swift strides. His hand shot out, not grabbing the whip, but closing around Thaddeus's thick wrist in a grip of iron. The motion was so fast, so precise, it was almost silent. The whip fell limp. Thaddeus grunted, his eyes wide with shock and pain, his face turning a deeper shade of purple. He struggled, but the cowboy's grip was absolute. Silas's voice, when it came, was low and even, devoid of heat but carrying the weight of a granite slab. It was the first time Elara had heard him speak more than a single word. You'll never touch her again. The words hung in the oppressive air, a clean, sharp line drawn in the dust. It was not a request. It was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a law newly written. Thaddeus stared at Silas, his mouth agape, a mixture of fury and disbelief warring in his eyes. He tried to wrench his arm free, but Silas's grip was unyielding, the knuckles of his hand white. The larger man's bluster seemed to shrink under the weight of that calm, unwavering gaze. The power dynamic, as solid and unchangeable as the horizon just moments before, had fractured. Elara remained motionless, her mind struggling to catch up to the reality of the scene. The sting on her cheek was a dull throb, a faint echo of a pain that had been abruptly and inexplicably halted. She looked at Silas, at the set of his jaw, the hard line of his shoulders. He was not a big man, not like her uncle, but he possessed a density, a centeredness that made him seem immovable. He was a rock against which her uncle's rage had just broken. The silence stretched, taut and humming. Finally, with a visible effort, Silas loosened his grip. He did not shove Thaddeus away, he simply released him. The uncle stumbled back a step, cradling his wrist, his face a mask of humiliation and venom. He shot a look at Elara, a look that promised retribution, a deeper, colder kind of cruelty that would wait for its moment. Then he turned his glare back to Silas. You're finished here, Thaddeus spat, his voice raspy. Get your things. I want you off my land by sunrise. Silas didn't respond. He merely watched Thaddeus, his stormy eyes giving nothing away. He seemed utterly unimpressed by the decree. He had acted, and now he was waiting for the consequences, as inevitable and natural as the setting of the sun. Without another word, Thaddeus spun on his heel and stomped into the house, slamming the door behind him. The sound cracked through the quiet, a final, impotent show of force. The world rushed back in. The whine of the wind, the buzz of a fly, the frantic beat of Elara's own heart. She was alone on the porch with him. The rescuer. The stranger. She lowered the second bucket of water to the ground, her arm trembling with delayed shock. She could not bring herself to look at him directly, instead focusing on a loose thread on her sleeve. What was she supposed to do? To say thank you felt laughably inadequate, a small, polished stone offered in exchange for a mountain. She was terrified of what he had done, and what it would cost him, and what it would ultimately cost her. He had interfered. No one had ever interfered before. He had made himself a target to spare her, and in this desolate place, that kind of action was so alien it felt like a dream. She finally risked a glance. He had not moved. He was looking at the spilled water on the porch, then at the bucket at her feet. He bent down, his movements economical, and lifted the heavy bucket as if it were weightless. He walked past her without a word and poured the contents into the nearby horse trough. The thirsty animals drank deeply, their soft sighs of contentment the only sound. He then turned and walked back toward the barn, picking up the rope he had dropped as if nothing had happened, as if he had not just fundamentally altered the landscape of her entire existence. He disappeared into the cool darkness of the barn, leaving her standing alone in the brutal afternoon light. Her cheek burned where her uncle had struck her, but a different kind of heat was spreading through her chest, a confusing, terrifying, and utterly unfamiliar warmth. For the first time in 2 years, the suffocating blanket of fear had been lifted, if only for a moment, and the air she drew into her lungs felt impossibly, dangerously clean. A new kind of quiet descended upon the ranch, more fraught and heavy than the silence that had preceded violence. It was a listening quiet, a waiting quiet. Elara spent the rest of the afternoon in a daze, her movements automatic as she fed the chickens and collected their eggs. Every creak of a floorboard from the house sent a fresh spike of anxiety through her. Thaddeus remained inside, a brooding, volcanic presence she could feel through the very walls. She expected him to burst out at any moment, his fury renewed, perhaps with a rifle in his hand this time. But the door remained shut. The real object of her nervous attention, however, was the barn. From the corner of her eye, she watched Silas. He did not pack his bedroll. He did not gather his meager possessions. He mended a broken harness, his hands sure and steady, his focus absolute. He moved about his tasks with the same deliberate pace as before, as though his dismissal had been a mere suggestion, a piece of irrelevant noise carried on the wind. His continued presence was both a comfort and a source of profound unease. He had stayed. Why had he stayed? He was defying her uncle, a man who held the deed to this land and the power of food and shelter. It was a reckless, foolish act, and she could not comprehend the reason for it. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon, she saw him lead the horses out to the small pasture. He spoke to them in a low murmur, his voice a gentle rumble that the wind snatched away before it could reach her. He moved among them with a familiarity and ease that bespoke a deep, ingrained respect for the animals, a tenderness he never showed to people. She had noticed this before, the way the most skittish mare would nuzzle his hand, the way the old dog would thump its tail whenever he drew near. It was a language he was fluent in, a language of quiet care. She retreated to the small, lean-to room that served as her quarters, a space barely large enough for a cot and a small crate for her belongings. Sleep was impossible. She lay on the lumpy mattress, listening to the night sounds, the chirp of crickets, the distant cry of a coyote, the sighing of the wind through the eaves. Every sound was magnified, every shadow seemed to hold a threat. She expected Thaddeus to come for her in the dark. She expected to hear the crunch of Silas's boots as he finally walked away down the long, dirt track that led to the road. Neither happened. The house remained silent. The night remained still. When the first pale light of dawn crept through the single grimy window, she rose, her body stiff with tension. She crept outside into the cool, pre-dawn air. The world was washed in shades of gray and silver. And there, by the well, was Silas. He was already awake, already working, drawing a fresh bucket of water. He saw her and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He left the bucket near the kitchen door, a silent offering, before heading back to the barn. It was a simple gesture, yet it felt monumental. It was a continuation of his defiance, a quiet declaration that he was not leaving, that the new law he had written yesterday was still in effect. Thaddeus finally emerged from the house an hour later. He looked haggard, his eyes bloodshot. He saw Silas currying one of the horses and his face darkened, but he said nothing. He did not look at Elara. He stomped past both of them, hitched the wagon, and drove off toward town, kicking up a plume of angry dust. The unspoken battle had been won, for now. A fragile, temporary peace settled. But Elara knew her uncle. His hatred was a patient, simmering thing. He had been publicly humiliated on his own land, his authority challenged and broken. He would not forget, and he would not forgive. This was merely a ceasefire, not a surrender. And the man who had bought her this peace was still a stranger, a silent, watchful presence whose motives remained a mystery as vast and inscrutable as the land itself. The days that followed unfolded in a strange, suspended reality. The air on the ranch was thick with unspoken things, a low hum of tension that vibrated just beneath the surface of the daily chores. Thaddeus was a thundercloud on the horizon, perpetually present and threatening, but he kept his distance. His interactions with Alara were clipped, his orders delivered with a sneer from across the yard. He never looked her in the eye, and he never came within arm's length. His cruelty had not vanished, it had merely changed its form, becoming a campaign of small, cutting neglects. He would forget to tell her the grain shipment was late, leaving the chickens unfed for a day. He would misplace the whetstone she needed to sharpen the kitchen knives. They were petty, spiteful acts designed to wear her down, to remind her of her powerlessness without resorting to the physical violence that Silas now prevented. Silas, for his part, remained an enigma. He was a ghost of a man, present but rarely heard. His defiance of Thaddeus was a silent, ongoing act. He did not argue or posture, he simply existed where he had been told not to, worked when he could have left, and stood as a quiet bulwark Alara had never asked for. He seemed to anticipate her uncle's petty cruelties. A small sack of oats would appear near the chicken coop. A newly sharpened axe would be leaning against the woodpile just when she needed it. He never acknowledged these acts. There was no knowing glance, no self-satisfied smile. He simply saw a need and met it, his actions as practical and unadorned as the landscape around them. Alara began to watch him, to study him in stolen moments. She learned the rhythm of his day, the pre-dawn visit to the horses, the methodical mending of fences, the way he would pause at midday and stare out at the western plains, his expression distant, almost haunted. She saw the skill in his hands, whether he was calming a nervous colt or reshoeing a draft horse with swift, economical movements. He possessed a competence that was absolute, a deep knowledge of the land and its creatures that felt innate, ancient. He was a part of this harsh world in a way Thaddeus, with all his bluster and ownership, never could be. A fragile trust began to form, not through words, but through these shared, silent observations. One sweltering afternoon, while she was hanging laundry, the clothesline snapped, sending the clean, wet sheets into the thick dust. Her shoulders slumped in defeat. It was another small, exhausting setback in a day full of them. Before she could even begin to gather the soiled linens, Silas was there. He had a length of new rope and, without a word, began to string it between the posts, his knots swift and sure. She stood by, feeling useless, wanting to thank him but finding the words stuck in her throat. When he finished, he simply nodded toward the basket of laundry and walked away. The silence between them was no longer entirely uncomfortable. It was becoming a shared space, a language of its own. It was a silence built on the understanding of hardship, of the futility of empty words in a place that demanded action. He was teaching her, she realized, that protection wasn't always a grand gesture. Sometimes it was a new rope. Sometimes it was a sharpened axe. Sometimes it was just the steady, reliable presence of someone who saw and understood, and who chose, for his own reasons, to stand between you and the storm. The vast, empty landscape that had once felt like a prison began to feel different. It was still harsh, still demanding, but in watching Silas move through it, she started to see its subtle beauties, the way the light changed on the distant bluffs, the resilience of the wildflowers that pushed through the cracked earth, the vast, star-dusted clarity of the night sky. He was as much a feature of this land as the rocks and the wind, weathered, quiet, and possessed of a strength that was deep and unyielding. The fear in her heart had not vanished, but it had made room for something else, a small, tentative seed of curiosity, and a fragile, burgeoning respect for the silent man in the barn. The sky had been a bleached, hazy white for 3 days, the air unnaturally still and thick. The animals were restless, an anxious energy rippling through the horses in the corral, the chickens refusing to stray far from their coop. Alara felt it too, a pressure in her ears, a prickling on her skin. It was the kind of oppressive calm that heralded a violent change. Silas moved with a new urgency, his usual deliberate pace quickened. He spent the morning securing the shutters on the house and the barn, checking the roof of the lean-to where she slept, his hammer blows echoing in the heavy air. Thaddeus watched from the porch, a flask in his hand. "Wasting your time, cowboy," he slurred. "Just a bit of weather." Silas didn't look at him, continuing to batten down a loose section of the barn door. His focus was absolute. By afternoon, the horizon to the north had turned a bruised, ugly purple-gray. The wind began to pick up, not the usual steady plains wind, but a fitful, violent gusting that tore at the trees and whipped dust into stinging clouds. The temperature plummeted. A hard, icy sleet began to fall, rattling against the roof like thrown gravel. This wasn't just weather, it was a blizzard, arriving with the unholy speed and fury that only these plains could conjure. "Get the rest of the stock in." Silas's voice cut through the rising shriek of the wind. It was the first direct order he had ever given her. There was no time for fear or hesitation. Elara grabbed a heavy coat and plunged into the maelstrom. The world outside was a swirling chaos of white and gray. The sleet had turned to thick, heavy snow, driven horizontally by a wind that stole her breath and bit at any exposed skin. She fought her way to the small pasture, her boots sinking into the rapidly accumulating drifts. The 2 cows and their calf were huddled against a fence line, their backs to the wind, already coated in a layer of ice. She tried to herd them toward the barn, but they were panicked by the storm, unwilling to move. The wind howled, a physical force that threatened to knock her off her feet. Despair began to creep in, cold and sharp as the ice stinging her cheeks. Just as she felt her strength failing, a figure materialized beside her out of the blinding snow. It was Silas. He had a rope in his hand. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. He simply pointed toward the lead cow, then toward the barn, a clear, concise instruction in the heart of the chaos. She understood. She moved to the side, herding the animals from the flank, while he took the lead, using the rope and his calm, steady presence to guide the terrified cow. They worked in tandem, a silent, desperate team against the overwhelming power of the storm. He moved with a knowledge born of experience, keeping his body between the wind and the calf, using the terrain to shield them as much as possible. She followed his lead, her fear replaced by a singular focus on the task. Together, they managed to wrestle the animals into the relative safety of the barn, the door groaning shut against the gale. They were both gasping for breath, their hair and clothes frozen stiff. Thaddeus was nowhere to be seen. He had, predictably, retreated into the warmth of the house, leaving them to fight the storm alone. The barn was their sanctuary. The air inside was still cold, but it was blessedly free of the wind's relentless assault. The familiar smells of hay and animals were comforting. They spent the next hour securing the rest of the animals, the horses, the chickens, even the old barn cat, ensuring they had food and water to last through the storm. They moved around each other in the lantern light, their actions synchronized, anticipating each other's needs without a word. He would pass her a bucket, she would have the latch open. She would point to a weak spot in the wall, he would find a board to brace it. The shared crisis had forged a new kind of intimacy between them, a partnership stripped down to its most essential elements, survival, trust, and mutual effort. The storm was a monster, but inside the groaning, creaking walls of the barn, they had created a small island of order and safety. The blizzard raged for 2 days, a relentless, shrieking vortex of white that erased the world. The barn became their universe. The lowing of the cattle, the soft snorts of the horses, the rhythmic sound of their own breathing, these were the only realities. Thaddeus remained barricaded in the house, a problem for a later time. Survival was the only imperative. On the second night, the cold deepened, a penetrating chill that seemed to seep through the thick wooden walls. They had built a small, contained fire in a metal drum in the center of the main floor, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows. The animals were settled, their warmth adding a small measure of comfort to the cavernous space. They sat on opposite sides of the fire, the silence between them no longer tense or awkward, but companionable, heavy with the shared experience of the storm. Elara stared into the flames, her hands wrapped around a tin cup of melted snow water. The ordeal had stripped away her layers of fear and caution, leaving a core of exhaustion so profound it felt like a strange kind of peace. "My father," she said, her voice quiet, a little hoarse from disuse. "He used to say a blizzard has a voice. You just have to be quiet enough to hear what it's saying." Silas looked up from the piece of wood he was whittling, his stormy eyes reflecting the firelight. He didn't speak, but his attention was absolute. He was listening. Encouraged by his focus, she continued, the words coming slowly, as if being pulled from a deep, forgotten well. "He and my mother had a small farmstead back in Ohio. It was green there. So green you could almost taste it. We had a creek behind the house." She paused, the memory so vivid it was painful. "They took the fever in the same week. The preacher said it was God's will. It just felt empty." She had never spoken of this to anyone, certainly not to Thaddeus, who saw her grief as just another weakness to be exploited. Sharing it now, in the warm, firelit dark of the barn, felt like letting go of a heavy stone she hadn't realized she was carrying. "I had nowhere else to go. My mother's brother. Thaddeus, he was the only family I had left." She didn't need to elaborate on what her life had been since. The story was written in the way she held herself, in the faded bruises and the perpetual caution in her eyes. She fell silent, the confession leaving her feeling hollowed out, yet strangely lighter. The fire crackled, filling the space her words had left. She expected him to say nothing, to simply retreat back into his own quiet world. Instead, after a long moment, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "I had a brother." The words were simple, but they carried an immense weight. He looked down at the small piece of wood in his hands, turning it over and over. "We were heading for Oregon. Had a stake, a plan. We got separated in the mountains during an early snow. Like this 1 inch." He stopped, his jaw tight. He didn't need to say the rest. The loss was there in the space between his words, in the sudden bleakness of his expression. He had his own ghosts, his own grief that drove him. He wasn't just a quiet man, he was a man who had lost his anchor and been drifting ever since. In that moment, he was no longer an enigma. He was a person, marked by loss, just as she was. The chasm of silence and uncertainty that had separated them had been bridged by a shared, unspoken understanding of sorrow. They were two survivors, huddled together against a storm that was both outside the barn and within themselves. The wind howled, but for the first time, Alara did not feel entirely alone in its lament. The blizzard broke on the third morning, leaving behind a world transformed. The landscape was buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white, the sun glittering on its surface with a painful brilliance. The silence was absolute, profound. The wind was gone, and the world felt scrubbed clean, new. But the fragile peace of their sanctuary was shattered the moment Thaddeus emerged from the house. He was surly, his face puffy, his eyes narrowed with suspicion at the sight of them working together to clear a path from the barn. The shared ordeal that had forged a bond between Alara and Silas had only deepened her uncle's resentment. He saw their competence as a personal affront, their survival a rebellion against his authority. He could not attack Silas directly, the man's quiet strength was a wall he'd already tested and found unbreakable. So, he turned his venom back toward Alara, seeking a crueler, more insidious weapon than his fists or the whip. A week later, the peddler's wagon arrived, a rare and usually welcome event. Thaddeus spent a long time with the man, his voice a low murmur from the porch. Alara paid it little mind, busy with her chores. It was only later that evening, as Thaddeus sat cleaning his rifle, that he chose to strike. "That peddler gave me a fair price," he said, not looking at her. "For a piece of worthless old junk." Alara paused, a cold dread coiling in her stomach. "What junk?" He finally looked up, a cruel, triumphant smirk on his face. He enjoyed this part. "The slow, twisting knife. That little silver locket you're always hiding away. Your mother's, wasn't it?" The world seemed to drop out from under her. The locket. It was a small, tarnished silver oval with a faded etching of a rose. Inside was a tiny, fragile portrait of her mother and father, their faces smiling out at a world that no longer existed. It was the only thing she had left of them, the one tangible piece of a life and a love that had been stolen from her. She had kept it hidden in a loose floorboard in her room, her secret talisman against the despair of this place. "You didn't," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You couldn't." "It's done," he said, his voice full of satisfaction. "Bought me a few bottles of good whiskey. A much better use for it, I'd say, than gathering dust with a dead woman's picture inside." The casual brutality of his words stole the air from her lungs. It was a violation far deeper than any physical blow. He had reached into her past and desecrated her most sacred memory. He had taken the last piece of her mother and sold it for drink. The strength she had been slowly, carefully gathering seemed to crumble into dust. The resilience she had felt in the barn, the flicker of hope, it was all an illusion. She was still his prisoner, and he could still hurt her in ways she couldn't defend against. She turned and walked away, her movements stiff, mechanical. She didn't run. She didn't cry. A cold, heavy numbness settled over her, a grief so profound it was beyond tears. She went to her room and looked at the empty space beneath the floorboard. He was right. It was gone. The last link was broken. The cold she had felt during the blizzard was nothing compared to the ice forming around her heart now. The silence from the barn felt different tonight. It no longer felt like a comfort. It felt like an accusation. What good was a protector who couldn't stop the deepest wounds, the ones that left no visible mark? The ranch, once again, was a prison, and its walls had never felt higher. Silas saw the change in her. The light that had begun to kindle in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a dull, vacant resignation. She moved like a phantom through her chores, her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. She no longer met his gaze, she looked through him, as if he were just another part of the bleak landscape. He saw Thaddeus watching her, savoring his victory. Silas knew he couldn't undo the damage. He couldn't ride to town and buy back a memory. He understood that the locket's value was not in its silver, but in its history, a history that was now lost to her forever. For 2 days, he watched her grieve, his silence a respectful distance. He saw the profound depth of her pain and knew that empty words of comfort would be an insult. On the 3rd morning, he was gone. His bedroll was missing, his saddle gone from its stand. The most skittish mare, the one only he could handle, was also gone from the corral. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through Alara's fog of grief. He had left. He had finally given up, driven away by the ugliness of the place, by the hopelessness of her situation. She was alone again. Truly alone. The wall he had formed around her had vanished, and Thaddeus was there, on the porch, watching her, a knowing, predatory smile on his face. He had won. He had not only broken her spirit, but he had also driven away her only ally. The day was an exercise in pure terror. Every shadow seemed to hold her uncle's approach, every sound was the precursor to a blow. She worked with her head down, bracing herself, waiting for the inevitable return to the old ways. But as the sun began to set, casting long, golden fingers of light across the snow-dusted plains, she heard the familiar sound of a horse. It was the mare, and on her back was Silas. He rode into the yard, dismounted, and led the horse to the trough. He moved with his usual unhurried grace, as if he had only been out checking a fence line. He had not abandoned her. Relief washed over Alara so powerfully her knees felt weak. He had come back. He unsaddled the mare and began to rub her down, his movements methodical. He seemed to be ignoring Alara, but after a few moments, he walked over to her. He stopped a few feet away, his expression as unreadable as ever. He held out his hand. It was not the locket. Resting in his calloused palm was a small, exquisitely carved bird, its wings half spread as if caught in the moment of taking flight. It was fashioned from the pale, smooth wood of the cottonwood tree that grew by the creek, the only real tree for miles. He had carved it with painstaking detail, the delicate feathers, the sharp little beak, the intelligent turn of its head. It was a simple thing, yet it was perfect. He held it out to her, an offering. She reached out a trembling hand and took it. The wood was smooth and warm against her cold skin. It was impossibly light. She looked from the bird to his face, her eyes asking the question she couldn't voice. "He can't sell that," Silas said, his voice low. It was all he needed to say. He understood. He knew that what Thaddeus had stolen was not an object, but a symbol. So he had created a new one for her. Not a replacement for what she had lost, but something different. The locket had tied her to the past, to her grief. This bird, this was about the future. It was a symbol of freedom, of resilience, of a spirit that could rise above the dust and the cruelty. It was something made by his hands, for her, from the living wood of this very land. It was a promise. A testament. It was the most profound act of kindness she had ever known. A single tear, hot and cleansing, escaped her eye and traced a path through the grime on her cheek. She clutched the small bird in her hand, its wooden form a solid, grounding presence. She looked at Silas, and for the first time, she truly saw him. And in the depths of his stormy eyes, she saw not a stranger, but a friend. The small wooden bird became the center of Alara's world. She kept it in the pocket of her dress, her fingers often seeking its smooth, familiar shape. It was a constant, tactile reminder of Silas's gesture, a secret source of strength she could draw upon. The grief for her locket remained, a tender scar on her heart, but it was no longer an all-consuming void. The bird was not about looking back, it was about enduring the now. It was a promise that new things could be made, that beauty could be carved from the harshness of this place. A subtle but profound shift began within her. It started with her posture. She began to walk with her shoulders back, her head held higher. When she passed her uncle, she no longer flinched or dropped her gaze to the ground. She met his hateful stare with a calm, steady look of her own, one that held no challenge, but also, no fear. The change infuriated him. Her quiet defiance was more maddening than tears or pleas would have been. He could not comprehend a strength that didn't rely on brute force. He would try to bait her with insults, his voice dripping with venom. "Orphan girl, living on my charity. You're nothing." In the past, those words would have flayed her open. Now, her hand would close around the bird in her pocket, and she would simply turn and walk away, leaving him sputtering in impotent rage. Her voice changed, too. It lost its timid, questioning edge. When she spoke, which was still rare, her words were clear and direct. She gave the old dog a command, and it obeyed. She spoke to the horses in the same low, reassuring tones she had heard Silas use, and they responded to her touch. She was claiming her space in the world, one small, deliberate act at a time. Silas observed this transformation with his usual quiet watchfulness. He saw the new confidence in her step, the firmness in her jaw. He never commented on it, but his approval was evident in small ways. He began to teach her, without ever calling it a lesson. While mending a fence, he would hand her the tools, showing her with his hands how to stretch the wire taut, how to set a post so it would hold against the wind. When a calf fell ill, he worked alongside her through the night, explaining the properties of the herbs he gathered, showing her how to mix a poultice. He was entrusting her with his knowledge, treating her not as a helpless victim, but as a capable partner. Their shared work became a conversation, more eloquent than any spoken dialogue. They moved together with an ingrained rhythm, a team forged in crisis and solidified in the daily struggle for survival. The ranch, once a symbol of her oppression, was slowly becoming something else. It was still a place of hardship, but it was now also a place where she was learning her own strength. The land was not just something to be endured, it was something to be understood. She learned to read the clouds, to know the scent of rain on the dry air, to recognize the tracks of the coyote and the hawk. This place was a part of her now, and she was a part of it. Thaddeus saw it all, and his hatred grew. He saw the ranch functioning, even thriving, under their shared care. He saw the respect the animals had for them. He saw the silent, unbreakable bond that had formed between the taciturn cowboy and his once broken niece. He was becoming irrelevant on his own land, a ghost of authority, and this realization curdled in his gut, poisoning him, driving him toward one last, desperate act of destruction. He could not stand to see them build something from the ashes of the life he had tried so hard to burn to the ground. He began to drink more heavily, his days dissolving into a sullen, whiskey-fueled haze, his eyes holding the promise of a final, violent storm. The end came on a moonless night, the kind of thick, oppressive dark that swallows all light and sound. A hot wind had been blowing all day, rattling the windows and kicking up dust, setting everyone on edge. Thaddeus had been in town and returned late, his wagon weaving drunkenly up the path. Elara heard him stumbling around inside the house, cursing and knocking things over. She sat on her cot, her hand wrapped tightly around the carved bird, a sense of dread coiling in her stomach. The confrontation she had been bracing for was finally here. The door to her small room was kicked open with a splintering crash. Thaddeus filled the doorway, a lantern held high in one hand, a bottle in the other. His face was a bloated, demonic mask in the flickering light, his eyes wild with liquor and rage. "Get up," he snarled, his voice a thick slurry. "You and that silent bastard of yours. You think you can take my home from me? I'll see you both in hell first." He took a staggering step into the room, his shadow leaping up the wall behind him. "This is over. I've sold the deed. A man from Cheyenne is coming in the morning. He doesn't want any squatters. Especially not useless baggage like you. You're leaving. Tonight. With nothing." This was it. His final act of spite. To not just cast her out, but to erase her completely. In the past, this threat would have paralyzed her with terror. But as she looked at the pathetic, drunken man swaying before her, she felt not fear, but a cold, clear anger. She rose slowly from the cot, her movements deliberate. She did not cower. She did not plead. She stood straight and met his gaze. "No," she said. The word was quiet, but it was as solid and unmovable as granite. Her defiance seemed to shock him. He stared at her, his drunken mind struggling to process it. "What did you say to me?" he roared, taking another step, crowding her. "I said no," she repeated, her voice stronger now. "This was my mother's home before it was yours. You've poisoned it. You've let it rot. But you will not throw me out of it." He lunged, grabbing the front of her dress, his foul breath hot on her face. "I'll throw you wherever I please." Just as his other hand came up to strike, a shadow fell across the doorway. Silas was there. He hadn't made a sound. He stood with his arms crossed, his face set like stone, watching. He did not immediately intervene. His presence was a statement in itself, but his stillness was something more. It was a testament of faith. He was letting her face this first. He was showing her, and Thaddeus, that she was no longer someone who needed to be shielded. She was someone to be stood with. Seeing him there, Elara felt a surge of courage. She looked her uncle dead in the eye. "Let go of me," the authority in her voice gave Thaddeus pause. But his rage was too far gone. With a roar, he shoved her backward, sending her stumbling against the wall. He raised his fist, his face contorted in a mask of pure hate. That was the line. Before his fist could fall, Silas moved. He was not fast like before, his movement was a deliberate, irresistible force. He took Thaddeus by the collar and the belt and simply lifted him, turning him and propelling him out of the small room. Thaddeus crashed into the dirt outside, his lantern shattering, plunging the yard into near darkness. Silas stood over him, a silhouette against the star-dusted sky. Thaddeus scrambled to his feet, pulling a knife from his belt, its blade glinting. He charged, a wild, clumsy bull. Silas sidestepped the attack with fluid ease, caught the man's wrist, and used his momentum against him. Thaddeus went down hard, the knife skittering away into the darkness. He lay on the ground, a gasping, defeated heap. Silas looked down at him, not with anger, but with a kind of weary finality. The fight was over. The poison had been excised. In the gray light of dawn, a buggy arrived. Not the man from Cheyenne, but the town sheriff. Silas had ridden out before sunrise. Thaddeus, sobered and broken, was hauled away without a word, his final legacy on the ranch nothing more than a lingering smell of stale whiskey and a splintered door frame. When he was gone, a profound silence settled over the land. It was not the tense, waiting silence of before, but a deep, cleansing quiet. The wind had died down, and the air was cool and clean. Elara stood on the porch, watching the buggy disappear over the rise. The land stretched out before her, vast and imposing, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a responsibility. A possibility. A home. Silas came and stood beside her. They didn't speak for a long time, simply sharing the quiet of the morning, watching the sun paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. The world felt new, as if it had been born again in the night. "The deed is in your mother's name," Silas said finally, his voice low. He never had it legally changed. The lawyer in town confirmed it. He couldn't sell what was never his. Elara turned to look at him, stunned. All this time, the power Thaddeus held over her had been a lie. "It's yours," Silas finished simply. She looked out at the fields, the barn, the small, weathered house. Hers. The word was so immense it barely fit in her mind. It was a terrifying and exhilarating weight. She thought of the work, the hardship, the loneliness. Then she looked at Silas, at his calm, steady presence beside her. She wouldn't be alone. "It's too much for one person," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, and for the first time, a small, slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. It transformed his stern face, revealing a warmth she had only ever glimpsed in his actions. "Good thing there are two of us, then," he said. The future was an unknown territory, as wide and uncertain as the plains. There would be storms and droughts, hardships and heartaches. But standing there, with the rising sun warming her face and the quiet, capable man by her side, Elara felt a sense of peace settle deep in her bones. The resilience she had fought so hard to find was no longer just a flicker of hope, it was a steady, burning flame. She reached into her pocket and her fingers closed around the smooth, carved bird. A new chapter was beginning. Later that morning, they walked out to the northern pasture, where a section of fence had been damaged by the wind. He handed her the hammer. She took it, its weight familiar and right in her hand. Together, under the vast, open sky, they began to rebuild.